Washington Journal continues.
And we want to welcome back to our table Senator Roger Wicker, Republican in Mississippi, serves on the Armed Services Committee as well as the Budget Committee. So let me begin with Egypt. And USA Today had this headline, U.S. quandary, was it a coup?
Well, there's no question that is a quandary and a problem not only for the administration but for the Congress. Let me draw an analogy. After 9/11, 2001, there's no question we went to war in Afghanistan against al-Qaeda and against the Taliban, and it's been a lengthy engagement. We never declared war. The president never asked the Congress to, and Congress never passed a resolution to declare war against the Taliban or against al-Qaeda. And the reason is it would have triggered a number of provisions in insurance contracts, and it just would have created more problems than it solved. So we went to battle, we went to war without a declaration of war, and of course the same thing actually in Iraq, and we've done this several times before. There was authorization, there was funding always by the Congress, but not a declaration. What the administration knows is that to officially call what the military did in Egypt a coup would trigger a cutoff of aid. And that's something that should be debated, and there are differences of opinion on Capitol Hill about whether we should do that. But in saying we're not going to characterize it as a coup, it leaves the Congress with more options, and it leaves the administration with more options. And I, in fact, support the administration's hesitation to rush right out and term this a coup.
Okay, so what are your options in Congress? What are the administration's options?
Well, I think certainly we have to, first of all, acknowledge that this has been a very unsuccessful one-year experiment with our State Department, and certainly an unsuccessful attempt at democracy on the part of the Egyptians. Our State Department, I think, and the Obama administration has not exerted the leadership that we needed to make it clear to the Morsi administration that the direction they were going was absolutely wrong. And then it's a missed opportunity for the forces that would move toward democracy in Egypt. As a matter of fact, President Morsi was on a path to what we've seen in many developing countries: one vote, one man, one vote, one time. I mean, this person was elected president by with about 51% of the vote. During the course of his 1 year in office, he suspended the Constitution. He basically declared himself a dictator, limited the power of the courts to review actions, emasculated the parliament, and was becoming another Pharaoh. That is not my definition of democracy. Winning one election by 1 or 2% of the vote and then suspending all transparency, suspending all rule of law, and suspending the independence of the courts. So the Morsi administration had an opportunity to move Egypt forward. As a matter of fact, they did about as much damage in 1 year as the Mubarak administration did in 2 or 3 decades in terms of stifling the rule of law and moving toward a Western-style representative government.
So what are the options?
Well, I think the options at this point are to try to work with the military, try to work with the newly appointed leadership to have elections as soon as possible, to make it clear that they have to be inclusive, to offer the aid not only of the United States in giving our advice on this, but also the assistance and advice of the community of nations. Everyone is interested in this country that houses 1/4 of the Arab population on earth. We have an interest in them being successful and not spinning out of control. So diplomacy is hard. Diplomacy takes a lot of patience, a lot of fast footwork, and it's not going to be easy. But we can't go in and dictate. Well, money has been there, and so let me talk about that. I've always supported the assistance that we've given to Israel and Egypt pursuant to the Camp David Accords. And this has been quite controversial. We had an amendment to take this away earlier this year in the United States Senate. But the Camp David Accords, where Egypt agreed not to attack Israel, this has been successful since 1978. We've not had a shooting war between Egypt and Israel, and we've had relative peace. We haven't had great success in the peace process, but we've had an absence of military conflict for the better part of 4 decades. And so I support the continuation of our sale of military equipment to the Egyptians and of our continued assistance based on our treaty obligations under the Camp David Accords signed by President Carter and abided by and enforced by every Republican and Democratic administration since then. I think we need to be very, very careful in threatening the one entity of stability left in Egypt, and that is the Egyptian military, like it or not. They're the entity that is going to be there to keep this thing from spinning totally out of control.
So you disagree with your colleague, Senator John McCain, who sits on the Armed Services Committee as well. You disagree with him then on stopping aid?
Indeed, I very emphatically disagree with Senator McCain, and that's unusual because usually I agree with him. I agree with him on the Syrian question, for example. I note today in the news that Chairman Carl Levin also agrees with Senator McCain, and he very much says we should move toward cutting off aid to the Egyptian military unless they can schedule an election. I think there's some caveats and provisions in what Senator Levin had to say, but as much as I respect those two senior members of the Armed Services Committee, and of course Levin is the chairman, I have to disagree, and I would hearken back to what Senator McCain said on the floor of the Senate earlier this year in opposing the Paul Amendment to cut off the sale of F-16s, the sale of F-16s to the Egyptian military, and that is, we don't need to do anything at this point to weaken the most stable organ of that society, and that, like it or not, is the Egyptian military.
This is the Baltimore Sun editorial. Their view is, with generals back in charge, transition to democracy just got a lot harder.
Well, that is their opinion, and I don't agree with that. I don't see how anything that President Morsi of Egypt has done over the past year could be seen as a transition toward democracy. It was actually a transition away from democracy. More prosecutions of political opponents in a year's time than we had had in decades under Mubarak. And Mubarak was criticized by the United States government for that. More oppression, the total suspension of Parliament, the total emasculation of an independent judiciary. This was, in effect, it had become, in effect, a one-man dictatorship elected one time by the people, and with no prospect for inclusiveness. So I'm sure there are many times I would disagree with the Baltimore Sun, but this would certainly be one of them. I think democracy is in trouble, but this gives us an opportunity to put all the parties together, to use our good offices as a State Department, and see if some consensus can be reached toward moving Egypt toward a more inclusive society.
Sky News on their website is reporting Egypt is set to hold parliamentary elections by early 2014. This is after the country's interim president adopted a swift timetable for change. That means Egyptians will have 5 months to amend the constitution, suspended after Mohamed Morsi was removed from power in a military coup, before heading to the polls 3 months later.
Well, you know, that is overnight news. And at first blush, I would say that's welcome news. It may be that they're listening to voices like those of Chairman Levin of the Armed Services Committee, who suggested that unless swift action was taken to move toward a restoration of democratically elected government, we need to explore ending our aid. So that's a hopeful sign. I hope it works. It will be difficult. It's a difficult country, but it's a historic people, and has been a historic ally of the United States. And so we need to do what we can as a foreign policy to make it work.
Got a few phone calls lined up here for you. Lewis in Spring, Texas, independent caller. Hi there.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my call. Congressman, I'm listening to the conversation, and it sounds eerily familiar to what we did previously in Egypt. Now, the previous regime, you would say, was more or less installed by us, and I see this pattern, and it makes me wonder if this foreign policy is working. I mean, if we're really paying and we're sending pretty much money for poor people here and sending it to rich people there, how's that helping us? Didn't we use commerce or some other means? I just don't see how this is working, and I'd have to, tell you, I'm a Republican really at heart, but I've had to shift to an independent view because this neoconservative policy, Ron Paul was right. I don't think this is working, and I think we're going to get the same results if we keep sending them money. I'm all for protecting Israel, and I'm all for, siding with our allies, but I just don't see how this works.
Okay, Senator.
Well, I wouldn't characterize what we did with Mubarak over the decades as installing that government, if I understood the question right. I think if you ask our Israeli allies, they would advise us that it's at least in the interest of the peace process and the stability of Israel for us to continue with the military aid that we have sent to Israel and Egypt, based on our treaty obligations, and that really hasn't been. I would not characterize that as a neocon viewpoint. That's been something carried out by Carter, by both presidents, Bush, and by the Clinton administration. It is a continuity of foreign policy that we'd rather not have to do. But the alternative is to go back to conflict in the Middle East and the various outright shooting wars we had before 1978. So I would challenge the caller's assertion that this is a neocon viewpoint, and would rather say that it's a continuity of a bipartisan approach.
Boring File Clerk tweets in, should the UN send in peacekeeping troops to help establish the rule of law and maintain peace?
I would very much be opposed to that. For one thing, there's no peace to keep. I've always been skeptical of peacekeeping troops, but first and foremost, military people have to restore peace, and there has to be an absence of conflict before peacekeepers even have a chance. We're not at all to the stage there of having peacekeepers. But the situation is people are being killed, and it's I think your newspapers today it's spinning out of control at this point. So let's establish order, and then I know the United Nations and the Security Council will be weighing in for what that's worth.
What are the options for the president? You said that earlier, that not saying it's a coup gives the president several options. What are they?
Well, this is going to be the first really big test for Secretary of State Kerry, and I think he's certainly knowledgeable about the area, engaged. I mean, his wife is ill right now, but thankfully she's getting better. But he's going to have to get over there and roll up his sleeves and get very, very deep in this. This is one of our huge foreign policy challenges at this point. Foreign policy and diplomacy are very frustrating to me. They're very slow, and it requires conciliation and offers and counteroffers and backing and filling in. It's not the sort of thing that I like to do in a legislative body. But the talented members of our State Department who have some experience in this are going to have to get to work and see if we can pull all of the parties together in Egypt and convince them that it's in their best interest to move toward a society in which it isn't absolute majority rule. You know, it's been pointed out correctly in the last 2 or 3 days that Hitler was elected in the 1930s by majority rule and then completely dismantled the situation. So we need to use our diplomacy and convince them that majority rule is not the end of it. After that comes inclusiveness and building a civil society that works for everybody.
Yeah, that's what
and
Manic
protects the minority.
Manic DJ99 on Twitter says, democracy is the rule of the majority over a minority. We should be spreading liberty, a constitution protecting minority in Egypt.
I agree.
Let me go to Diane, Foster's, Alabama, Democratic caller. Hi, Diane.
Good morning, Senator. I'd like to first thank you for your well-grounded views. I am in agreement with much of what you have to say. I'd also like to say that I am, first of all, an American, but I'm also Muslim with ties to Egypt. We have family members over there, and they are safe. But I'd like to say that I don't think that we have taken any steps backwards. I think with the Muslim Brotherhood, they have an idea. They wanted to try out their idea. A lot of people knew this idea was going to fail, and they were never going to rest. They've been going on for decades. They promoted violence. They promoted a lot of things that people in more centrist, what I see mainstream Islam, do not agree with on the way to rule. And they will continue to push their agenda and push their agenda. And with Morsi in power, it shows that their ideas are not going to work. I think we had to get this out of the way. I think this is a step forward to get them to get their ideas out of the way, to show that they will not work. But
okay, Dan, I think we got the point, Senator.
Well, I think I agree with almost everything you say. I think you would know, being of the Muslim religion, that Islam is not monolithic. There are various degrees of belief as far as how much religion should be injected into the government, into the body politic, and clearly it's in our interest, and I think in the interest of stability around the world, for us to encourage the people who are tolerant of the views of others, even within the Muslim religion.
This is a piece written in today's Washington Post by a spokesman for the Muslim Brotherhood, Egypt's violent step backward. And he says, here are the stark facts. One of them being the Western governments that pretend to be on the sidelines are facilitating this chaos. You cannot call yourself neutral while justifying and financing a military coup against an elected president. News reports have indicated there were 5 high-level conversations in as many days between the Egyptian government and the Obama administration, including a phone call with President Obama in the run-up to last week's coup. 2 additional attempts at negotiation involved a European ambassador and an Arab foreign minister. The veneer of ambivalence is thin, and it is unconscionable to try to maintain this pretense in the face of an escalating violence against peaceful protesters.
Well, I think we will listen to any evidence that the writer has as to whether that is true. But what he's suggesting is that the Western powers, including NATO powers, including the United States of America, actually financed and helped engineer this coup. I've heard, actually, on the other hand, that our State Department during the time of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was actually too cozy with the Morsi presidency. So I think the truth will come out. I think there's some overstatement in that op-ed, and I would be very surprised if in fact it turned out that NATO allies, including the United States, financed and encouraged this military takeover. But I think the truth will come out.
Matt Smith tweets in this, referring to the Foreign Assistance Act, which requires suspension of all U.S. aid when a military comes in and overthrows a democratically elected president. And Matt Smith tweets in, if president can willy-nilly waive and redefine things to avoid the regulations and laws of Congress, what power do laws really have?
Well, that is a very good question, which actually I'm concerned about on a number of different fronts than whether this is a coup. I think the administration has to make a determination that it is a coup, and the law gives them that authority to make that determination. But I am very much concerned with the general thrust of that comment. And when we get a chance to move to, say, the Affordable Care Act, or what the president's doing with the regulatory agencies, or environmental policy, I absolutely agree with the caller that the president is ignoring the statute and taking powers upon himself that he does not have.
And we'll get to those topics in a little bit.
Let's do that.
All right. Financial Times editorial, by the way, this morning. U.S. aid to Egypt is lever to avert strife. Pressure should be deployed for inclusive government, is what the Financial Times says. Mark, you're next in Fordville, North Dakota, Republican caller.
Yes, good morning. I support the principles of democracy, i.e. majority rule, as espoused by Thomas Jefferson. I think we can see that the majority during the Civil Rights Movement led to successful abolition of Jim Crow laws and other laws that prevented blacks from being full citizens in this country. So I believe there's a common sense that exists in the majority of the average person, and that's why I support democracy in Egypt. However, what we really have is corrupt elites that have always existed in this world who want to subvert democracy and redefine it as a choice between two evils. And I think the intentions of both political parties in this country are evil. They have evil intentions, and they, in Egypt or Syria and elsewhere in this country, they really promote a fascist agenda, and they call it democracy. And I think that's what people really need to realize, is the leadership of both parties in this country are fascists.
All right. Well, let's get a response from Senator Wicker.
I'm not sure about that last statement. Was he speaking about the leadership of both parties in the United States being fascist? That's a pretty over-the-top comment. Let me say this about majority rule. And you know, I grew up in the South. The caller mentioned Jim Crow laws. Actually, there was a time when the majority of Americans supported segregation in our public accommodations. Majority of American voters supported segregation in the schools. And certainly in the South, where I grew up, the majority of the people supported the Jim Crow laws. And it was the courts who came in. It was not public opinion at first. It was the courts who came in and said, those Jim Crow laws are unconstitutional, and regardless of the fact that over half the people support them, they cannot stand because they are a violation of due process and equal protection. So let's bear that in mind too. I'm glad Jim Crow is way behind us, but it was not necessarily majority rule that got us there to start with.
Senator, on the health care law, the President announced last week he's going to delay that employer mandate for larger companies for 1 year. What happens next? Well,
first of all, let me say, I want the whole law delayed. I want it permanently delayed because it is a train wreck and it's not going to work. The idea that it was called the Affordable Care Act, and it has increased premiums to the extent it has, the fact that it's causing small businesses to make decisions not to hire people, to cut back on their hours. It's just a total disaster for the economy, and also at the end of the day, we're still going to have 30 million people not covered under this universal health care plan. So I would delay the whole thing. But here's the point I was making, and I would direct your attention to the op-ed page A13 of the Wall Street Journal today by Michael W. McConnell, where the author says Obama suspends the law. Under the Affordable Health Care Law, there's no provision for a waiver by the President of the United States. Many laws provide for that, but not the Obamacare law. And so the President, in saying we are going to delay this for a year, is just taking unto himself powers that he just does not have. And it strikes me as profound that so many people out in the public and so many people in the news media are just reporting this as if it's a matter of course. If the President wants to delay the employer mandate for a year, the President should come to the Congress and say, the law requires this to go into effect January the 1st. I need your authorization to delay it for a year under the statute. Otherwise, he's violating the statute. I would happily give the President the authority to delay this for a year. I don't think it's going to work in the long run. But for him just to do this by executive decree, I think is a pattern. And if I may quote Mr. McConnell, this is not the first time Mr. Obama has suspended the operation of statutes by executive decree, but it is the most barefaced. In June of last year, for example, the administration stopped initiating deportation proceedings against some 800,000 illegal immigrants who came to the U.S. before the age of 16, lived here for 5 years, and met a variety of other criteria. This was after Congress refused to enact the DREAM Act, which would have allowed these individuals to stay. In other words, the President asked Congress to pass the DREAM Act. Congress, for whatever reason, decided not to do that, and the President nonetheless said, I'm going to implement the DREAM Act as if it had passed. And so I would just caution my fellow Americans today, including members of the Fourth Estate, that we need to be careful about the President acting completely outside the law, even if it's well motivated, even if it's good policy from a substantive point of view. The President doesn't have the authority to ignore the law.
So how will you and your Republican colleagues respond to this? What can you do?
In divided government, there is hardly any way that a Democratic Senate and a Republican House is going to reverse this. But I would just cry at the top of my voice that this is a very slippery slope when we just sort of wink at the fact that the President is making a major decision not to enforce a provision of his signature legislative accomplishment, and he has absolutely no authority to do so under the law. Now, what we should do is have an election in 2014 about this issue and primarily this issue and its effect on the economy, jobs, and hiring. I think our economy is going to struggle along because of the Affordable Care Act, its impact on hiring, its impact on business, particularly small business. And I think this will be the key issue of the 2014 elections. And after that is over, then perhaps there'll be a majority in the United States Congress to fix this law and replace it with something that's market-oriented, that encourages healthy behavior, and moves us into something that actually is going to make health care more affordable. But this ACA is not such an act.
Another possible issue for the 2014 election is immigration reform. You voted no against the Senate bill last month. Here is Jeb Bush and Clint Bolick writing in the Wall Street Journal saying, no Republican would vote for legislation that stifled economic growth, promoted illegal immigration, added to the welfare rolls, and failed to ensure a secure border. Yet they essentially will do just that if they fail to pass comprehensive immigration reform and leave in place a system that does all of those things.
I noticed the wording there says fail if Congress fails to pass comprehensive immigration reform. I, for one, am in favor of passing comprehensive immigration reform. And so I would support Governor Bush and the other co-authors in that regard. The question is this Senate-passed version a comprehensive approach that's going to work? And my feeling is that it's not going to work. It's been improved. There's more border security, and there's the border surge, which I did support. But it doesn't yet answer the problem of the 40% of illegals who are here not because they came across the border, but because they stayed over. There's not a strong enough E-Verify portion of it. And I'll tell you what else. There's also this doubt among Republicans like me that this administration would in fact enforce the provisions they've agreed to. I mean, the Corker-Hoven Amendment, which I supported, calls for increased border security, hundreds of miles of additional fencing. But based on what I've seen and based on what Mr. McConnell said today in the Wall Street Journal, I can't be convinced that this administration would in fact implement the law as passed. And that has to be a consideration, certainly a consideration of my constituents out there.
So you voted for the Corker-Hoven border surge amendment?
I did indeed, yes.
And did the supporters then think they had your vote for final passage?
Well, I think some reporters who didn't understand the situation thought I was then a vote for final passage. But I made it very clear to Mr. Corker and Mr. Hoven and to my constituents that I viewed that bill as additional border enforcement to improve the bill. And if we could further improve the bill, I wanted to get to yes, but we were not able. We were, for example, the Portman Amendment to strengthen E-Verify and internal security was not even allowed for a vote. And so I was for Corker-Hoven because it was stronger on the border. Was the bill then strong enough to get my vote? No, and I made it clear to them from the outset that more would have to be done.
All right, back to phone calls here. Huntington, West Virginia. Nick is a Republican. Good morning.
Morning. Thank you for taking my call, and thank you, C-SPAN, for keeping this national forum for us all to have this public debate. So, Senator, I'd just like to ask one question, then I'll take my answer off the air. That's okay?
Sure.
Okay. How much money do you think military and security contractors would lose if members of Congress were required to know basic physics and acknowledge that Building 7's 105 feet of free fall on 9/11 is only possible if explosives were used, since no plane actually hit Building 7? And I'll take my response off the air. Thank you.
Well, I wish you well in West Virginia, and thanks for the nice shout out for C-SPAN, which I support. I guess there are always going to be people like the caller who believe that the Twin Towers came down on September 11, 2001 because of explosions rather than because of the crashing of airplanes. I think that's a settled issue. But this is the great thing about free speech in America. The caller is perfectly free to continue to urge his position and to convince as many people as he possibly can that he's correct.
And the whole point of our show,
Right.
there is an organized effort out there. In case our viewers are wondering, we get phone calls frequently from one group in particular who has mobilized their folks to call into this show in particular and question our guests, members of Congress, whoever, about what happened on 9/11.
Right. Well, I will tell you, as much as I disagree with them and cannot see how their reasoning holds up, I have close personal friends who feel the same way. So there you go.
Here is a tweet from somebody who calls himself Ghetto Redneck. Does Representative Senator Wicker support a budget conference, and when will it start?
I would hope we can have a budget conference. I have not been one of the ones objecting to that, and I think the people that fear this are people that don't know John Boehner very well. I think John Boehner is going to, if we get to conference on a budget, he's going to appoint House conferees that want our government to spend less and tax less, and he's not going to support any tax increases in this budget. So I realize we have a little difference of opinion in the Republican conference about that in the United States Senate. But I think, we've been calling for a budget for 3 years. We get a budget passed in the Senate. I didn't like it, but at least the leadership brought it forward as they're required to do, and I think we need to go to conference. And if it turns out it's a bad conference report, then the Republican majority in the House can vote it down, and would.
Jeremy Peters is writing in the New York Times this morning, Democrats plan attack on GOP filibuster use in a move that could bring to a head 6 months of smoldering tensions over a Republican blockade of certain presidential nominees. Senate Democrats are preparing to force confirmation votes on a series of President Obama's most contentious appointments as early as this week. If Republicans object, Democrats plan to threaten to use the impasse to change the Senate rules that allow the minority party wide latitude to stymie action.
The facts simply do not support the accusations of Senate Democrats in this regard. With the judiciary, for example, we are way ahead in the Senate of where the Senate was during this same time in the Bush administration. And as a matter of fact, I'll be testifying Wednesday afternoon in favor of Greta Brawner from Mississippi, a district judge, which I've been asking the administration to put forward a nomination for quite some time. The point is, not every nomination is going to get through. A John Tower didn't get through in a Democratic Senate. But by and large, if you look at the statistics, the Senate has confirmed more nominations, executive and judicial, by the Obama administration than previous Senates have done. So the facts just don't back that up. Now I'll say this, this is what when Republicans had the majority, they called it the nuclear option, and it was going to be the end of the world, and I guess cooler heads prevailed, and the gang of whatever, 16 or 12 or whatever it was, met together and said, we'll still allow filibusters of judicial nominations in extraordinary circumstances. At that moment, it was the Republicans trying to do away with the filibuster on nominations. So the shoe is on the other foot now. I would just caution my Democratic friends. They've been in the majority for a long time. Half of the Senate is new. They don't remember being in the minority. Someday, Republicans will have the majority again in the United States Senate. It goes back and forth. And I just think we're better served as a Senate if we operate on conciliation. If there were the facts to back up those allegations, I might feel differently. But I would ask our listeners to look at the facts, and I think the facts are that we've had quite a number and quite a high percentage of confirmations, both executive and judicial.
A legislative victory for you of sorts. The resolution on adoptions recently accepted. Explain what the resolution says and what will it do?
Let me explain the forum. The forum
right.
is the Parliamentary Assembly of the 57 nations that make up the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Meets in the summer every year. And the recent OSCE Parliamentary Assembly adopted my resolution encouraging international adoptions and acknowledging that countries have the right to set their own adoption laws. And Russia, for example, which we've been concerned about, has a right to prohibit international adoptions if they'd like to. But what the resolution says is, once an adoption has begun, and once the prospective parents have met the prospective child, then it's really a violation of human rights for a country to suspend the adoption in the middle of the game. My resolution was offered. We had 42 co-sponsors from all around Europe. Only 3 delegations really voted against it. Belarus, Russia, and perhaps another country that's closely aligned with Russia. But I think this is in response to the Russian ban on adoptions.
So does it have teeth?
It doesn't have teeth. Nothing in the OSCE has teeth, and we're kind of glad of that. I mean, I would hate to think that there was a parliamentary assembly that meets every summer that actually has enforcement power, but it has the moral authority of the judgment of a number of nations, and I do think it will strengthen Secretary of State John Kerry's hand as he tries to negotiate with Russia. There's some 300 adoptions, and perhaps more, that are in midstream. The parents in America know the children. The children in Russia are wondering when mom and dad are going to come get them and finalize this. And it's absolutely cruel to hold that up in the middle of the process.
Senator Roger Wicker, Republican in Mississippi, thank you, sir, for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the chat.